Welcome to another lesson on PowerShell 7. In my previous tutorial, I introduced you to variables. We learned how to create valid variables such as the ones that's shown on your screen right now. Remember, in PowerShell, all variables start with this special character, this $sign. And if you want to call in a variable or use a variable, you start with the same $sign and the variable name, and it will be pulling the information contained within that variable. For example, if I run this code right now, it will print whatever the values contained within these variables on your terminal. We also learned about few built-in variables such as the PS version table and the maximum history count. So those are variables that are already contained within the PowerShell built-in repositories. So if I run just those two variables, it'll print the PS version table and the maximum history count. So down here, so we learn that these are sometimes configurable. For example, maximum history count can be configurable, but the PS version table is not. We also learn about camel casing and also Pascal casing, even though I didn't use the term Pascal casing during my previous lesson. Pascal casing is basically you start with a capital letter and the second term also start with a capital letter. Camel casing is you start with a simple letter and the second term start with a capital letter. And the reason why we use these type of guidelines, because while PowerShell has some rules surrounding how variables can be created, so legal variables or acceptable variables versus not acceptable variables, it does not have any convention enforced by default. So there is no specific convention when you're writing PowerShell script to use a specific type of variable naming. So recall that I recommended that you stick to one type of variable naming. So if you go with the camel casing, your entire script should be using camel casing. And if you're using this type of variable, other types of variable, you should be using those other types of variables throughout your entire script, because that is the recommended way of writing script. Stick to one type. So having said that, today I'm going to cover more fundamental concepts on PowerShell variables before we move on to other topics in this lecture series. So I'm going to delete this part. So let's get rid of it. So I mentioned in the tutorial 5, which is the previous tutorial, that we can have more than one term in a variable. While this is not typically recommended, if you would like to create a variable with more than one term, you can use something called a curly bracket. So again, we start with the same $sign and we're going to start with the curly bracket, and because we are using Visual Studio Code, it automatically added the end curly bracket. So if you are using a simple text editor that doesn't have the PowerShell support, it may not add that the closing bracket. So just make sure that you start with the $sign, because it's actually a variable that we are creating, and you enter a curly bracket, and you can enter multiple terms with spaces in it. Like for example, I can name this as my variable, and I can equate to a value, let's say 2003. So notice that this variable has two terms in it. So in order to this variable to call in to action or to perform some function or print it out, you can use the $sign and you can use the my variable right here. So basically you have to type the same thing you have typed up here, but now because we have two terms, just like previous variable, you have to call in that entire names. Remember, this is the entire variable name and we are calling in, and if I run this code right now, it'll work just fine. See right here, it shows 2003 because that's the value contained within that variable. So this is how you can create variables with multiple names or multiple terms contained within them. So that's the first thing I want to introduce you in this lesson. You can have multiple terms, not just one or two terms. You can have many terms. Like for example, I can have my variable test, and as long as I call in my variable test here, and if I run this, it should still call in the same thing. Let me clear this screen. If I run the whole code, there you go. The my variable test, it has 2003 on it, and it will call in that function. So any term contained within this curly bracket can be part of the name. Like I can go crazy with my variable name. Like for example, if I want to put something like net IT geeks space Manuja space 2023, let's add a special character $_, which I don't recommend. So I have a crazy variable here, but as long as I call in this same variable down here, so call in the same variable. So as long as I run that entire code, what's going to happen is still going to print the value contained within them. So that means you can create variables with multiple terms on it. As long as it is within these curly brackets, you should be able to use this type of variable naming. I don't recommend using this type of variable naming, but this is just to show you that you can do that. So I'm gonna delete that and I'm gonna clear the screen. The other thing I want to point out, remember from my previous lecture that I told you that if you put a dash in your variable, like for example, if I put $, net dash IT geeks equal 2020, for example, that is an invalid variable. It even has a red squiggly thing underneath it because we are using Visual Studio Code. But you can make this variable valid, because remember, if you want to make this variable valid, you can put curly brackets in here, and that will make that variable valid. So the reason for that is this squiggly or curly brackets, what it doing is it's gonna make that entire term a variable. So even invalid variables can be turned into a valid variable. So for example, if I remove these curly brackets, and if I remove this curly bracket, so that I'm calling in this variable, I think is created, but if I run this code, it's going to give me an error message because that variable is not a valid variable. You can have a dash in between your variable names or terms, because that is not allowed, because dash is used for something else in PowerShell, right? But however, as soon as I create that curly bracket that I mentioned for creating multi-term variables, you can convert that invalid variable into a valid variables with the same variable term. So if I run this right now, it's perfectly valid. It's gonna give me a nice message display on terminal. So you can use curly brackets for sometimes to make a invalid variable valid, because the special characters such as the dash that cannot be used in PowerShell variables now will be valid because of these curly brackets that we put it together. While I do not recommend this type of complex variable names within your code when you are creating your own variables, there are useful places where you have to use these type of multi-term variables in order to call in some kind of data from your Windows machine. What I mean by that is, let's clear the screen. If I go with the get-child item, if I go $, and I want to call in the environmental value, so we're going to go environment value, program files x86. So to run this part of that code, to get this particular variable from your Windows machine, you have to have these curly brackets, otherwise it won't work. So because it has these special characters, in x86 program files, you have to use this this particular type of variable naming. So if I run this code, it'll actually output or the files within the x86 folder in the program files on your Windows machine, and this can be used within your script as such. So the point is that while we do not recommend using multi-term variables with spaces and special characters and etc contained within the variable name, there are sometimes it can be very useful thing when scripting in PowerShell, because Windows itself has certain terms that may require you to use these kind of curly brackets on your variable calling. So that's the point of using actual this particular type of variables in a like a well scripted codes. So again, don't recommend using curly brackets and create complex variable names, but there are situations like this one that's shown on the screen right now where you must use these curly brackets in order to call in a certain variables that are already contained within Windows. To reference a variable name that include braces and enclose variable names within the within that variable itself. So remember, just like any other variables, you have to recall that variable name enclosed within that braces itself with the entire variable name. So that special characters, for example, contained within that variable names has to be included in there as well. Like I can give you an example of that. So it's now speaking me here. Oh, not here. So I'm going to clear the screen on my terminal. CLS. Remember, CLS is a code short form for clearing your screen. So CLS. So I don't know why this is happening on my terminal. Let's go back on the terminal. Here you go. So what I mean by that is, like, if I put a so I'm gonna get rid of this variable, so because I don't need that. So what I mean by that is that if we use a variable name like $sign, let's say this, and we'll put a backtick, and then we'll put a value in here, and then in here I'm going to put a backtick right here just before that, and then is, and I'm going to put equal, and I'm going to put something in here. So this variable name uses braces and backticks dot, right? So if I go in here and it says, well, this is still a valid variable and it's just not assigned, it's not never been called in. And so if I enter this, like if I call this variable in right here, this will still be a valid variable. Like if I run this code, it'll print this variable name uses braces and backticks. So backticks are basically a character on your US standard keyboard on the top left hand corner, and this allows us to create a complex variable like this one. So basically, to reference a variable name, in other words, that include backticks, those enclosed variable name in braces and the backticks character can be used, and that will recall that variable in here. So the whole idea is creating complex variable names, and you can do it with backticks like this way with the value contained within this variable itself. So I'm going to clear the screen again, then I will move on to our next topic. So let's get rid of that. So the next topic I'm going to cover is the variable commandlets. So there are a couple of variable commandlets that you should be familiar with. Those include things like clear variable, get variable, new variable, remove variable, and set variables. Most of these terms are self-explanatory. In other words, like the Microsoft Windows, Microsoft company made it very simple, easy to understand, clear English, verb noun pair. So for example, clear variable is clearing the variable get variable will get the variable, and the new variable will create a new variable, and so on and so forth. But there are a few little details that it is important for you to understand earlier on when you are learning PowerShell. That will put the foundation for understanding how these commandlet works. So I'm going to go over them quickly. So the term clear variable, as it sounds, is a command that removes value from any existing variable. Clear variable does not remove the variable itself, but it basically what going to do is gonna clear the values contained within the variable. So if you have a variable name, for example, and you use the clear variable, it doesn't mean that it's going to delete the variable itself. Instead, what that's going to do is to clear the value contained within that clear variable. Like an example of it would be, let's say I create a variable call, so start with the $sign, I start net IT geeks equal to 55. So that's a variable. So I can call that variable in net IT geeks, and if I run this code, it will return 55. But now if I use this clear variable commandlet, so I'm going to use clear variable, and now if I now include the net IT geeks, now if I run this code net IT geeks, it's going to return nothing. So for example, if I run this code right now, guess what happened? At the beginning, it ran this part of the code, the script, and ran this. It returned 55, but the value contained within this variable got cleared, and this variable was done at this point. And when this variable now called in again, it came back with error message saying cannot find variable with the name 55 on it. So what that basically means, it basically clear that variable. So if I run it again, I'm going to clear the screen. If I run this entire code again, it's going to return the same error message at this point. So I can comment this this part out. So for example, if I comment this thing out, to comment in PowerShell, you use the hash character, and if I run the script again, it will run no problem. It has 55 value contained within them. But if you run the clear command, what's going to happen? It will return an error because it clear that variables from that memory. So that's why we use that clear variable command that allow us to clear information contained within the variable using that commandlet. The other one is the get variable command that provides access to any variables that has been created in the current session, as well as the default automatic variables contained within the PowerShell. So I'm going to clear the screen. I'm going to leave just the net IT geeks variable, and let's create another variable name. Let's call this whatever. Let's call it start time. Well, 55, and let's put another variable called Manuja Senanayake, and I'll call this Manuja. So it doesn't really matter, it's a bunch of variables. And if I use the get variable commandlet here, so get dash variable, what this is going to do, it's going to list all the available variables in this particular PowerShell session. So there is a valid command, and that's going to run all the available variables, including the variables that you have created within this script or your PowerShell session. So if I run this right now, what that's going to do, it's going to list all the variables contained within them. That includes the PowerShell variables itself, like remember the PS version table variable? Yeah, right there, right? And those variables also in here, but also the variables that we have created up here or contained within the history of this entire terminal. Remember the variables at the very beginning that we had in this tutorial was the net_IT_geek. Remember those variables? So those variables also shows up. See the complex variable example I gave you, which is the net IT geek space Sanuja space 2023 space $_, it still shows up in here. So what that basically doing, it get all the available variables, including the variables that are already in the script, and any variables that have been created during this session will be listed on your screen. Remember, PowerShell clears variables that are not on the script once the script has stopped running or reopening. So if you don't have, for example, I don't have that complex variable that I created here, like this one showing up here at the code on the script. So that means when the PowerShell session ends and I reopen this file, it will not list that. It will only list these three because those are the three that the get variable can see. What this get variable is useful, why we actually use this in most often time when we are writing script, is that it has certain pipe options. So in piping in command, piping in PowerShell is something that I have not yet covered in this lecture series. Basically, how you pipe something is you can put the pipe character, which is basically like a straight line character, and then we can say select dash object, and we can say name, comma, we can ask for description. And now if I run this, I'm going to clear the screen below so it's easy for you to follow. And if I run this script now, what that's going to do, it's going to create a table with name and description separated, so it's easy for you to follow and you only get the information that you need to know. So remember, the previous one doesn't have the name and description. Maybe I should run that one as well. So let's do this again. So this select object name description, it just gave the name and description in a nice little table. But without this part, without this pipe part, it just listed all your variables with the values. So for example, name and value, because by default that is what the Windows have set for this get variable commandlet. But with using the pipe command, you can get very creative in finding your variables. Again, I'll cover pipes later sometimes in this series, but for now, know that this type of commandlets can be modified based on your needs. Let's clear the screen and move on to our next commandlet. So I'm going to put CLS again to clear the screen here, and I'm going to delete all of this at the top, so we have a fresh page. The next commandlet that we're going to cover is the new variable commandlet. As the verb noun pair clearly define, the new variable commandlet basically going to create a new variable. So it is new dash variable, and then you can have a switch, which is I'm going to define it with a dash. So in PowerShell, switches are dash. That's how you're going to define a switch, and it's going to be the name switch. And how do I know the name switch is associated with new variable commandlet? Well, you will know as you go through scripting classes and tutorials in this lecture series. Yeah, so either you are using something like Visual Studio Code, where it will let you know that these are the switches available for this particular commandlet. Here you go. Or you need to know it offhand. So I know this switch exists, the name, so that actually gonna name our variable. So let's call our variable the test Sanuja. So it's a new variable, test Sanuja, and I'm going to give it a value. So I'm going to use another switch called dash value, and I'm going to give that a get date. So I'm just going to use another commandlet just for fun. So now if I do this, this is same as saying let's create a variable, let's say test Sanuja equal to get date. So this is doing the same thing as this. These are both valid way of creating the test Sanuja variable. Just to prove my point, let's call this test Sanuja 2, because otherwise it's going to create some issues. So let's to prove my point, what I can do, I will comment this one out. So in PowerShell, if you want to comment something out, you use the hash special character, and I'm going to call in the test Sanuja variable. So I'm going to put a $, because variables are calling with the $. I'm going to call in the test Sanuja. I'm going to run this code. So if I run this code, what that's going to print is the current date and time. Why? Because we created that new variable using the new variable commandlet. Now if I untick this one and I run this part of the code now, so let's run the both parts of the code, have two variables now. So I'm going to clear this, and now if I run this code now, what that's going to do, it's going to create the get date variable right here, and it's going to create another variable with the get date with a different value, like a different different variable name, and it both gonna print the time and date right here. And notice we also have a warning on our terminal saying, hey, warning, the new variable name Sanuja value already exists. That because of the test Sanuja has been ran before, that's why that error message is coming, because we ran this type of code again. Like I can actually show you what I mean by that. So let's create a new variable here. So let's say test Sanuja 3, and let's say test Sanuja 4 here. And if I run, it shouldn't give me any error messages. Here you go. I run it. See, there's no error messages. The reason why you saw that error message there is because I have already ran this part of the code, and the Windows PowerShell knows that I already created this variable and say, hey, you have already created this variable and you are trying to create that same variable again. So that's why it gave me that error message. So if I run this code again, it's going to give me an error message because this variable already created and exists. Notice that this is happening because that we are using that new variable command to create that variable that already contained within our Windows memory. So there is a memory already allocated to this test Sanuja 3 when we first ran this code, and when you request that same new variable commandlet with the same variable name, it'll spit out an error message. So that's why you get this error message. So this is a good time to mention some error messages. They are very useful. Like PowerShell have very useful error messages, which I mentioned before in my previous lessons. So I'm going to clear this screen again. So you might ask the question, why do we even need a commandlet to create a new variables when you can create a new variables by simply typing the variable right away, like this we have shown down here? So why do you even need that? So notice that in the new variable commandlet, we have many options. For example, I can go space and I can put another tab in here, and there are description, option, visibility, scope, confirm, verbose. There are a whole bunch of other options. Like for example, if I go with, let's say I want to add like options, for example, that forces about this variable to be a specific value. So that allow you to prevent this variable from being modified. For example, you can change certain options in here. You can force this variable to behave in a certain way, and you can see there are a lot of other switches available here. So pass through, etc. I will cover what is pass through, what are scopes, and etc in my future lessons. But the reason why we have this new variable commandlets instead of just creating variables like this is because it allows us to basically have much more options associated with this particular variables that we are creating up here. So that is the reason why we have this kind of thing. For example, if I put for options, and if I put constant, what that's going to do is basically it's going to force us that option to be constant throughout your script, that allow you to prevent the variable from being modified once it has been created, and it will not going to change again. So like for example, if I delete this right now, and let's say this is Manuja 5, and if I call in this function Manuja 5, this variable I mean. So remember, also in PowerShell, it doesn't matter whether it is capital or simple, as long as the variable name is same when you don't have any spaces, or if you don't have any underscores and stuff like that, this variable name is same as this variable name, even though it's not camel case. So like for example, if I run this code right now, it'll spit out a time. So the time, it says right now 5:12 a.m. in the morning on February 12th, and now the time is 5:13. So do you expect this value to change now? You can try that. So if I run this command again, this variable again, it shouldn't change. We don't need to create this variable anymore. Remember, it's already created, but the time, you can see that it didn't change. The time is constant. So now the variable has been created up here, and the time has been put in here because the option says it remain constant. It's not going to change. But if I remove this option, and if I run this commandlet again, that will actually change that time. So let me see, I'm going to clear this. So let's say Manuja test 6 and 6, and then if I run it, and then it'll change the time. So that means it took the time right, at the that time it's 5:13 57 seconds. It just changed to 5:14. So because that option for forcing it to be a constant is not there, that time value has changed. So it actually allow you to create situations where you can create very complex variable rules associated with your variables using the new variable commandlet. So we will be using this type of options, this type of constants in my future tutorials, because this is very useful, especially if you want to run a script and you want to make sure that the time variable does not change throughout the script. This is what we do to enforce that particular rules, so on and so forth. The next variable type that I'm going to cover is the set variable. So again, I'm going to clear my screen and I'm going to delete all the stuff up here. Just like before, verb noun pair, set variable. It is actually setting a variable. In other words, set variable command allows certain properties of an existing variables to be changed. For example, let's say I create a variable called object count equal to 25. Is it a valid variable? Yes, it is. You can have spaces in here, or you can have no spaces. It's up to you. So to keep it constant, I'm going to put no spaces. And remember, this yellow jiggly line basically means the variable it has been created but never been used. So PowerShell is giving you a warning. So it's nothing wrong with that variable. So in fact, if I recall that object count, that yellow line disappears. So it's a valid variable. Now, if I run this code, it'll say 25. We expect 25 value to be displayed, and it displays 25. However, let's modify this code without modifying the actual value containing at the very beginning of this variable. So to do that, we use set dash variable, and now we need to define that value to something different. So to do that, first remember we need to call in the variable. So it's an object count, and we're going to use a switch. The switch is dash value. So there's again value. There are a bunch of switches: value, include, exclude, force, visibility, scope, etc., which I will cover later sometime. for now, just change the value. So I'm going to set this variable options, and the option that I'm going to change is the value, and I'm going to change the value to, let's say, 2025 and press enter. Now when I run this code, this entire code, it's going to change from 25 to 2025. So if I clear the screen on the terminal and if I run this entire code, it started out, this object count when I print it up here, it started out as 25, but it changed to 2025 because I used the set variable commandlet to force change or change the value contained within this variable. So just like it sounds, the verb noun pair says set variable, it's set the variable. Again, the reason why you have this type of set variable commandlet, because unlike just changing this value up here to 2025, the set variable also commandlet comes with so many switches that you can use and other options that you can use to change the behavior of that variable. So it's not just setting something different for the value. You can do many other things such as the scope and pass through visibility, how you can force it, etc. Again, I'm not going to go over this right now because I'm going to cover the visibility and stuff like that in a later tutorial when we are covering functions, etc. So just keep in mind, you can change the value just by entering some other value here and recalling it. But the reason why we have the set variable commandlet built into our PowerShell is because it allows us to do much more than just changing few items in there. So that is our set variable commandlet. And next one we will cover today is the remove variable commandlet. So let's clear the screen here and let's get rid of this. Just like the name suggests, remove variable verb noun pair basically means it's going to remove the variable. So in other words, that if this is the only variable that is referring to an object, and the object will be removed from the memory shortly after you are running the remove variable commandlet. So the remove variable command is very useful if you want to clear some memory from your script that contain that variable information. So for example, let's create a variable called my name, and I'm gonna call this as Manuja Senanayake. So that's my name, Manuja Senanayake. And if I call in this variable my name, what we expect to see here is to print Manuja Senanayake. So if I run it, it printed my name, Manuja Senanayake. Now, if I use the remove variable commandlet, so remove variable commandlet, and then I can use the variable that we have created at the top here, which is the my name, and then by running that, I basically have done here is to remove that particular name associated with that. So particular value associated with the my name command variable. So for example, right now, if I run this entire script, so let's run it. What it did, it printed my name right here, but the second time it's not going to have that value next time it prints. Actually, I should print that my name. So if I clear this screen, so if I run right now, so first time it printed, but the second time that is not there. I can also prove to you this, like I can show you this by commenting this out. So again, in PowerShell, you can comment things out with the hash character. So if I clear this on my terminal, now if I run my name, it's only going to run this line of code and this line of code, the script, and it is not going to see this one at all. And if I run it, it's going to print nothing. So it did create the variable. It entered the Manuja Senanayake string as the variable value. However, as soon as the remove variable commandlet came in and gave remove that variable, this variable become an empty variable. The only reason he printed last time because if I because it's printing up here. So for example, if I run this one right now, it'll print Manuja Senanayake first. It is printing right here, right there, but then it printed nothing because it has been removed. So it's a useful little commandlet in your script when you're especially doing some intermediate and advanced scripting. It'll allow you to remove variable information from a from using just this commandlet itself. So again, there's a lot more to that commandlet than what we just quickly covered here, but I will go over that as we progress through this course. So the variable commands are a way of interacting with existing variables that the PowerShell has, and it allows you to create this many way of interacting with your variables or the variables already contained within your PowerShell itself. So in other words, like these commandlets allow you to be more flexible with your code, and you can create much more versatile and complex code using these type of commandlets. So let's clear the screen because we're gonna move on to our next topic, which is the variable provider. PowerShell includes a provider and a drive which allows variables to be listed, created, and changed using get child item, test path, so on and so forth. So it's a way of again interacting with PowerShell variables. Like for example, what I mean by variable provider is that if I go get dash child item, and then if I go variable and then if I put like that, then you can basically the output can in here could include the variables as well as any variables that created by a module that might have imported. So basically you can run this code, these pieces of code, and that will basically give you all the variables in your PowerShell session, including the PowerShell variables that we have created, like these guys, these NetIT Geeks ones. Those are our custom variables. They're all gonna appear just like that. So this is what we call a variable provider. And again, as the provider behave much like the file system. In other words, you can put that test path in that or whatever you're going to use, whether the variable exists. You can test that as well. Like for example, if I go like PowerShell variable slash verbose preference, for example, and if I clear this and if I run this part of the code, and it's going to give you the verbose preference, it says silently continue, and so you can you can basically do certain things with the variable providers. Another example of this would be the set item that may be used to change the value of a variable or create a new variable. Like for example, if I want to go set not down here, if I go set dash item, and in here we can go variable, and again in the set item you can say, hey, I want a new, and I want a value, and then you can say variable, and then you can go on and so do so on and so forth. So in other words, like it allow us to like interact with our variables in another way. So those are it's called as variable providers. And again, you will understand how this being used in PowerShell script as we move through this course. Just for now, in back of your mind, keep that in in your thoughts that you do have something called a variable provider. So in other words, it is another way, an optional way of interacting with variables. And when we discuss the many other options associated with this in the future, you'll get a better handle of this. I know this is kind of confusing right now, but as we go through this course, I will cover what variable scopes are So just keep in mind that you do have these variable scopes that you can use with your PowerShell scripting. I mentioned the term scope just few seconds ago actually, and I'm not going to cover the scopes associated with variables in this particular lesson. I will cover it in the future. But however, now you have the foundational knowledge on PowerShell variables. In next few tutorials, we will go over the other little items associated with this, including arrays. Array is a special type of variable because it contains more than one value in the items. And if you like these type of tutorials where I cover in-depth knowledge on how to write a PowerShell script, all I ask in return is to thumbs up this video and subscribe to my channel. Until next lesson, thank you so much and have a nice day.